How many of us are still in some quiet corner, the child we were at our most earnest? The one who took things seriously, who wanted terribly to be good before life complicated what goodness even meant. I think of this often when I think of a small girl in a farmhouse near Nuneaton, kneeling at her bedside each night, working out her salvation with the seriousness of someone twice her age. Hello, and welcome to the Sunday Echo with me, Cate Field, exploring and pondering the lives of fascinating and interesting people who have left their wonderful impression on our world. I am delighted that you have joined me today. Today, we will explore the life of a Warwickshire woman, born Mary Ann Evans, and who became, under a name she chose for herself, one of the great novelists of the English language, George Eliot. She was, by every account, a fervent child. Evangelical Christianity in the 1820s and 30s was not a gentle thing. It asked for scrutiny of the self, a daily accounting of sin, a suspicion of pleasure and art and levity. Young Mary Ann took this with a real intensity. She gave up novels for a time, considering them frivolous. She wore plain dresses. She corresponded earnestly with her old governess about the state of her soul. I find something moving in this, even knowing where the story goes. This particular kind of seriousness, belonging to clever, watchful children, is so interesting. And Mary Ann Evans had it in abundance. She read ferociously Latin, French, German, mathematics, theology. She was largely self-taught, largely alone, and in a household that didn't quite know what to do with her because she was so clever. Her mother died when she was only 16, and so then she was expected to run the house for her father. The life of the mind for her grew up in the gaps between duty and solitude. The turn, when it came, arrived slowly and through reading and research rather than through rebellion. She encountered the work of Charles Hennel, and then, decisively, the German biblical critics. Strauss, whose Life of Jesus she translated into English when she was 25, working through it line by line at her writing desk in Coventry, apparently making herself quite ill with the labour of it. This was not a book that comforted. It examined the Gospels as historic documents, as human testimony shaped by human hands and human hopes. Something in Mary Ann Evans met this scrutiny with a kind of clarifying attention. Her faith, so carefully built, so sincerely held, gave way under the weight of her own honesty. Her father was distressed. There was a real rupture. She stopped attending church, and for a period, the household held its breath over what this might mean for a young woman's reputation and her prospects. She did eventually resume some outward observation out of tenderness and love for her father, but while her inward conviction had already moved on. And I think this is worth really thinking about. The moral seriousness that had once organised itself around sin and salvation now organised itself around something she would spend the rest of her working life exploring: the intricate, ordinary business of how one person treats another. This is where I think her later translation work becomes so telling. In 1854, she took on Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity, a work that located the divine within human feeling and human relations. Feuerbach's God was, in some sense, humanity's own capacity for love and sympathy, sort of projected outwards. and named sacred. Whatever one makes of the theology, the ethical centre of it clearly took root in Mary Ann Evans. Sympathy. She used the word often and meant it with a real precision, and it became her lifelong subject. The disciplined, imaginative effort of understanding another person's suffering as vividly as one's own. We can really trace this right through her novels. Think of Silas Marner, the weaver whose faith is broken by a false accusation and whose long solitary years are healed by the accidental arrival of a small child at his hearth. And think of my favourite of her heroines, Dorothea Brooke in Middlemarch, whose spiritual hunger finds nowhere adequate to settle, and whose growth across that vast novel is really a long education in seeing other people more clearly. Casaubon, Lydgate, Rosamond, even when clear sight costs her comfort. Eliot's narrator pauses at one point to remark that if we had keen vision of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow or the squirrel's heartbeat, and we should die of that roar which lies on the other side of silence. I've never read a sentence that better describes what her whole art was reaching for. The roar of ordinary feeling made audible, made bearable through patient attention of fiction. Let's stay with Middlemarch for a little while, because I love it, and because I think it holds the whole of her later thinking in one place. To understand its vast, intricate web, we have to look back at Eliot's own roots in Warwickshire. So we need to kind of just go back a little bit. So she knew the rhythms of provincial English life down to the soil. When she took up the pen and renamed herself George Eliot, she gained more than the chance to be taken seriously in a male-dominated literary market. The name became like a shield, letting her dissect the provincial world that she'd left behind with an unparalleled, piercing empathy. Nowhere is that dissection more beautiful than in Middlemarch, a novel Virginia Woolf once called one of the few English novels written for grown-up people. It's a book about choices and compromises and the quiet friction between our grandest spiritual ambitions and the mundane realities of daily life. To see this friction at work, it helps to sit two women in the novel side by side. Dorothea Brooke is our modern Saint Teresa, a young woman of good family and modest fortune, restless with more ambition to do good than her circumstances know what to do with. She looks at the elderly, pedantic scholar, Edward Casaubon, and mistakes his dry intellectualism for a monumental spiritual quest, believing that by marrying his mind, she might anchor her own drifting soul. It's a heartbreaking error of judgment. Dorothea's tragedy is the narrowness of the channel that her world offers to a spirit as immense as hers. Whatever the worth of her ideals, he was not enough. Susan Garth, by contrast, is the anchor of the ordinary. A former schoolmistress, a mother, the practical backbone of the Garth family. She patches clothes. She teaches her children at the kitchen table while the bread is baking in the oven. She reads human nature with a sharp, unblinking eye. Eliot treats her with a real reverent dignity, a virtue that doesn't make the history books, but it keeps the world from falling apart. Her spiritual fulfillment lies in the precise, loving execution of her daily duty. Eliot holds both women in the same warm light. Dorothea's grand ideals and Susan's daily competence are, in her hands, two shapes, the same seriousness can take, and the novel's famous closing lines gather them both in. for the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been, is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. There was a second reason for her pen name, and one that has nothing to do with the literary market. By the time Adam Bede appeared in 1859, Mary Ann Evans was already living the private life that would follow her for the rest of her career, and anonymity offered her some cover while it lasted. That private life is the part of her story that still, I think, asks something of us as listeners. In 1854, she began living with George Henry Lewis. He was a philosopher and critic. He was already married, although he was separated from his wife, Agnes Jarvis, who had by then formed another household of her own. Now, divorce, for reason of English law at the time, was not available to Lewis. Years earlier, he'd registered one of Agnes's children by another man as his own, and under the law of that time, that single act of kindness had already counted as forgiveness, closing off any legal pathway from the marriage. So Mary Ann Evans, as she called herself in private life, and George Lewis simply began their life together publicly under the same roof, presenting themselves as a couple in everything but the legal document of marriage. They travelled together to Weimar and Berlin while she completed the Feuerbach translation. And then they returned to England to set up house. Society, predictably, recoiled. Many of her own family cut off contact. Her brother Isaac didn't write to her again until after Lewis's death, which was more than 2 decades later. Interesting times indeed. But what strikes me, reading the letters from this period, is how little defensiveness there is in her. She didn't campaign against the institution of marriage, and nor did she frame her situation as a public argument to be won. She just simply lived it with what looks like a settled, quiet steadiness alongside a partnership that by every account nourished her work extraordinarily. Lewis managed her correspondence. He shielded her from harsh reviews. He believed in her fiction before almost anybody else did. And he encouraged her in 1856 to try her hand at a story rather than essays and translations that she'd built her reputation on. Without that encouragement, there might have been no George Eliot at all, just Mary Ann Evans, the formidable critic and translator. A considerable thing, to be sure, but not our George Eliot. There is a wider story behind all of this, and the one historians call the Victorian crisis of faith. Advances in geology, evolutionary biology, and the new historical criticism of scripture were unsettling literal readings of the Bible right across the country, and Eliot stood close to the centre of this. Like I said before, she was raised a devout evangelical Anglican. She carried a deeply religious temperament all her life. Walking away from orthodox doctrine left her moral seriousness intact, and if anything deepened it. Eliot's own philosophy became what she and her contemporaries call the religion of humanity. Her great insight was that if God or an afterlife did not exist to enforce morality through rewards and punishments, then our responsibility to one another in this world becomes infinitely more urgent. God, immortality, duty. How inconceivable the first, how unbelievable the second, and yet how peremptory and absolute the third. George Eliot recalling a conversation in 1873. For her, the highest moral calling was meliorism, the belief that the world can be made better through conscious human effort, and in particular through the cultivation of empathy. She believed the human ego is naturally blind, a kind of optical illusion that makes us feel ourselves to be the centre of the universe. True morality, in her view, is the slow, sometimes painful process of widening our vision to see that other people carry an inner life just as vivid and as fragile as our own. This shows in the way that she builds her narratives. The villains are rare in her fiction. What causes harm again and again is something smaller and more ordinary. So, a lack of imaginative sympathy, an ego too narrow to see past itself. When Rosamund Vincy or Edward Casaubon act cruelly, Eliot draws close to them rather than standing apart in judgment, letting us see that narrow, frightened mind behind the failures. Her novels are exercises in empathy. She once remarked that if art doesn't widen our sympathies, it does nothing morally. By carrying the intense moral seriousness of her evangelical childhood into the secular, scientific thought of her adulthood, Eliot arrived at a new kind of literary ethics, one that asks only for close attention, a willingness to look at our neighbours, to step outside of our own egos, and to bear witness to the hidden, unhistoric lives unfolding all around us. George Lewis died in 1878, after 24 years together. Mary Ann Evans was utterly undone by it. She refused visitors, buried herself in his unfinished manuscripts, and for a long while her own life seemed to come to a standstill. And then, quietly, John Walter Cross entered the picture. He was a Scottish banker, a close family friend who'd managed the couple's investments, and he was 20 years her junior. What began as shared grief, his own mother had recently died, grew gradually into a profound mutual dependency. He became her rock in practical matters, and she gave him something of her intellectual and emotional depth in return. In May 1880, at the age of 60, Eliot did something that startled even her most progressive friends. She married John Cross at St George's, Hanover Square, in a full Orthodox Church of England wedding, having spent over 2 decades calling herself Mrs. Lewis without the law's blessing. For the Victorian public, the scandal was twofold. Firstly, the age gap and the strange reversal of a woman who had defied convention for so long, suddenly submitting to its most respectable form. But for Eliot, the marriage brought a quiet joy of its own. It reconciled her at last with her estranged brother Isaac, who sent his warm congratulations after a quarter of a century of silence. But there's a strange little coda to this part of the story, one biographers still argue over. Weeks into the honeymoon, staying at a hotel overlooking Venice's Grand Canal, on a stiflingly hot June day, John Cross leapt from their window into the water below. Gondoliers and local doctors pulled him out, and the couple put on a brave face afterwards, blaming sudden fever, and biographers have wondered ever since what really lay behind that strange moment. Was it the pressure of marrying so considerable an intellect, or a panic over the years between them, or something closer to a genuine breakdown? Well, whatever the truth of it, he recovered, and the months that followed were marked by a deep, protective tenderness between them. That final chapter was tragically brief. Just 7 months after the wedding, in December 1880, Eliot died from a throat infection compounded by the kidney disease that had troubled her for years. Cross was left heartbroken, and he went on to compile George Eliot's life as related in her letters and journals, carefully editing her correspondence into the image of a dignified, saintly Victorian intellectual, smoothing away in the process many of the sharp, rebellious edges that made her so remarkable in the first place. I keep returning to the shape of the whole life when I think about her. A child memorizing scripture by candlelight, a young woman translating German philosophy at a desk that made her ill, a mature novelist building entire towns and generations out of her attention to how people fail and forgive one another, a partner who lived her private life in full view, letting the cost of that fall where it would, because the alternative was a kind of dishonesty that she seems never to have been capable of. The evangelical little girl and the humanist novelist were, I think, the same person all along, still asking the same question that she had asked at her bedside as a child. How ought I to live? And how ought I to treat the people around me? Only the ground she stood on to answer it had shifted. From certainty handed down to understanding, built up slowly, sentence by sentence, sympathy by sympathy, across a whole working life. And that is where I'll leave her today, at her writing desk, with that great, terrible, tender roar of ordinary human feeling that she spent her life learning to listen to and to make audible for the rest of us. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you next time when I wonder about more fascinating people. Take care. Bye-bye.